Hey everybody, let's talk about using visual progression to help build your video game narratives. Now, this is a very well understood technique outside of the video game world, but I don't see it talked about much inside of the video game world, which is a shame because this is a fundamental technique. It's a very powerful, basic technique, and I'll tell you how to use it. Pretty straightforward. Simply put, we're using a visual medium. We are telling the players a story via a visual. We can also tell them audio and stuff like that, but we're focusing on visual for today. This means that our stories should be visual stories. Our narratives should be visual narratives. And we generally don't think of things like that, do we? We tend to map out our narratives like this, right? And it's like, that's not touching. That's not using all of our assets. Let's give you an example of how this would happen in, say, a movie. Let's say that we've got a movie about some Navy guy, and so we initially show him accepting a new medal, and that's like the opening scene, right? And he's pinning new metal on his chest, and he's got lots. They glitter. And then we cut away to a visual of him putting them in a pin box and then shutting them away in a drawer and then closing the drawer. That is the basic idea behind a visual progression. A visual progression is using some visual touchstone and then making changes to it to explain the changes in the story. That's about as easy as it gets, right? But we never think about that in video games. Let me give you an example of a video game version of this. So if we look at, I just blanked on the name. Great. There is a video game where you play a whole tribe, and basically there is a part of the video game where they show your tribe walking in this silhouetted side view. The Banner Saga, that's the name. And basically, the more tribe people you have, the longer and more varied this group is, right? So at the beginning, you start with something small, but then you get like wagons and giants and, who knows what else, horse people, horse riders, whatever, right? And so things get bigger and longer, and the progression gets more and more impressive. And that's a core part of the experience of the Banner Saga. It's getting more and more people lining up behind you. Your tribe is growing. Your responsibilities are growing. And the random events are always going to just screw you over because that's the kind of game it is. And now your stakes are high. And now you're getting screwed over big time because you've got too many people following you around. It's a core part of the narrative of the game. How many people follow you? How many people depend on you? That is something that the game is about. And that's really what I'm talking about here. What is your game about? What is the core narrative pulse of the game? In this case, it's how many people are following you. So instead of just giving you a number, they do give you a number, but they also give you this beautiful visual. And the key here is that we can't really control how long the player is going to stay inside of the gameplay part of whatever we're doing. I mean, we can if we really try, but in general, we're not ever going to be able to control the pacing of our games as well as we could control the pacing of a movie. If for nothing else, the player might put a game down and come back to it the next day, or they might play straight through, or they might put it down for a week, and they might put it down in a very slightly different spot than some other player. These interruptions will never allow us to deliver a story that is as cohesive as a movie, because it's expected that you're just going to watch the whole movie. This makes thinking visually a lot more important for us, because when the player comes back to this game, they're not really going to remember as much about it as we might hope, but when they see this visual, they'll immediately remember what this game is about. They'll be like, oh, that's right. I got like 500 people following me, and every time I make a decision, 40 of them die. This visual touchstone allows us to remind the player of the context of the story, remind the player of the progression of the story. And that's much more powerful than we give it credit for, and it's something that we should really be thinking about. And you might be thinking things like, oh, well then, are you saying I should just have fancy dials? So like your bullets, you got 34 bullets left. I should show that as a giant stack of bullets, a giant pile of bullets. And it's like, well, probably not, because how many bullets you have is probably not the main narrative progression in this game, in your game. Unless it's a very unusual game, maybe some kind of zombie game or something. How many bullets you've gathered is not going to be a major concern. Not unless the bullets represent lives or something. So your bullet count goes up and down all the time. It's not something that is narratively interesting. So you probably wouldn't want to use a narrative touchstone, a visual touchstone to represent it, because the player just needs to know how many bullets they have. They don't need to be emotionally affected by how many bullets they've spent. It didn't make any sense, so you don't do it. But let's go ahead and give you another example. You're building an RPG and you're gathering people behind you. Let's say you're playing Dragon Age. You're creating Dragon Age. You're not playing it. Someone else is playing it. How do you do your character select screen? Well, if you're like Dragon Age, what you do is you put them all in a camp, a neutral camp, right? And every new NPC you get takes up a new spot in the camp. Here's the spot where the DLC vendor lives. But your other characters, they get to like have a little bit here and there. And so that is how they do it, and that is not very visually compelling. It's nice because you can wander around it and, type third person and actually talk to people, but it doesn't have the visual punch. So the game never really feels like you're gathering a group of motley heroes together. It feels more like you're doing other things like, fighting off villains or gathering resources or whatever else. The point, how many people you've got following you and who they are, is played down quite a bit. And that's probably what they wanted. But Mass Effect, on the other hand, uses a different visual. Do you remember it? Well, let's go through it again. So you're right here in the center of the character select screen, the hero. And as you get more characters, they show up behind you. Now in Mass Effect, this was a very static screen. It wasn't one of the ones where this was like some kind of high concept thing. It was just basically like a fighting game select screen. But the visual would always remind you of who your characters are, and all at the same time, they're all waiting there for you, trying to get you to, choose them. They're waiting. If you need them, they're right there. This is a very powerful solution. As you go through the game, you get more people standing there waiting on you, standing there waiting for your tactical choices. And it makes you feel like a leader. It makes you feel like you've got these heroes backing you up. And we can push this way, way further than Mass Effect did, because they weren't really thinking about it like this, right? So let's say that, 2/3 of the way through the game, your hero decides, oh, you know what? I'm probably not the best leader. Maybe I should give leadership to someone else, like Morden or something, right? Someone else. I don't think Morden was his name. I think Morden was the bad guy. One of the other dudes, a scientist dude. So maybe I'll talk to this scientist dude. And when you go to the character select screen, lo and behold, your character has turned to face the scientist dude, and the scientist dude has turned to face you. And that is a visual cue that this is what's going on. You are giving that scientist dude some power, and he's taken over control of all of the tactical choices. And then scientist dude sacrifices himself to save the team. As the leader, he offs himself to save everybody. Of course, in the real game, he offs himself to save the Krogan, which is also quite nice. But in this case, we're going with a different path. So after that, you are once again shown on the, in the leadership role on the main screen here, but there's a gap. This gap that is never filled. Any player who plays through that and then puts it down for a week and comes back, that's going to punch them in the face every single time. They're always going to remember that there's a gap there. There's someone missing, and that it was, their fault, or not necessarily their fault, but their player character's fault, their own flaws. And now they have to, that's what's driving the player character forward now to be worthy of that sacrifice. That's a simple visual technique that makes sure that the player can never forget what happened there. The player can never forget the context or the progression because it's baked into something they see all the time. It's baked into a core part of the game. And then, of course, you sacrifice yourself to kill a Reaper or whatever. And all that's left behind is like, I don't know, a plinth or a broken sword or something. I don't know. We'll change it to fantasy all of a sudden. It's a sword. And then during the final scene, the closing scene of the game, each of these people comes forward, they drop a flower on your sword, and then they go their own way. They split apart, and none of them go off together. None of them ever see each other ever again. That's not going to be an ending that you're going to have dry eyes through. Even if it's a little bit incompetent, that ending is going to get a lot of people crying. So that is the sort of thing you can do when you are thinking visually in this way. This is a technique that is very common in movies and even in books. It's just not how we think about it in video games, and I think we need to, because the power to remind the player of the context of the story in such a core emotional way is something we can't underestimate. If the player stops playing, we need to pull them back in, and we can give them a summary. Last time you came by, you were searching for the Dread Pirate, and your friend Glabloblog had been captured. Fine, but it's much, much more powerful if our summary is, say, I don't know, a pop-up book, something that we can change and reuse with different contexts. So, it's like when you visit the game, it's boom, here is a pirate ship coming into the pop-up book, and there's the pirate is here, and there's our friend Shamoobdaboob tied to the mast. Oh no. So that is something we have to think about. What are the core visuals of our narrative? How do we use those visuals to remind the player of how all the contexts are changing, to inform the player of how the narrative is moving forward? And we just don't think about that enough, and we should. There are a lot of other options, of course. If you're not in the mood to disrupt something by creating a scene, a literal scene, like this scene shows you the characters all in a row. Maybe your game just doesn't have that sort of thing in it. There's no ability to show that. You can still use repeated visual calls, repeated visual elements, and then show them in different contexts. For example, the easiest possible way. Let's say that you are playing, you're making something like Life is Strange, where you play one character, and then there is another character who is, kind of the more aggressive character that follows you around and gives you all your opinions and stuff. This is a very typical sort of approach for games that can afford to be fully voice acted. And if you always show this character from the same fundamental camera angles when they are introducing a new area, then you can use their appearance to anchor the area. Not only do you get them, in a familiar spot to tell you that you're about to enter a new area, they also have a facial expression. They have something to say. They've got a new costume, and whatever is behind them is something they can comment on. It's a very, very fast and easy way to get the player to feel something about this new location, something that they might not feel if you just put the location up, something that they might not feel if you just did a voiceover. Having that person anchor them by popping into the scene with, the standard whatever their character is motions, and then being like, hey, this police station's shitty, or hey, let's go swimming, or hey, let's have a party over there, or hey, I think I saw some dudes with guns, or whatever you have her say. That is a powerful way to introduce this scene, and it's not just the voiceover. It's the way she's framed, how the light falls, what her expressions are, what she's wearing. These are all visual elements that we can change because we have a constant. We have a touchstone. The fact that she is standing there And the fact that she is, in one of her standard poses, we can change everything else, and that touchstone will keep ushering the player back into the scene in the way you want them to be ushered into the scene. And it's going to become a meme. There's going to be memes where she's introducing random things on the internet because you've now created a touchstone, and people understand the progression of the story through her, and they realize they can use her to make other people understand other progressions. And that's great. That is what we want. We want something so powerful that it becomes a meme, if possible. And of course, near the end of the game, she's not there. She's been captured, or she's gotten sick, or whatever. She's run away because you screwed up. And so we have the exact same shot with some kind of, scene, whatever thing we're trying to introduce. And we look over there, we pan the camera in the exact same way we would, and we just hold for 3 seconds and then move on. And because that visual touchstone is so baked into our story progression, the player will immediately go, "Oh, my heart." And that's what we want. And then at the end of the game, we'll show our friend over here, and we'll step in. That is a powerful way to do things. And it doesn't seem like it's something that your narrative needs, right? Like, who cares about that? But that's not a small thing. That is a core part of your narrative, and it will drive so many of your decisions, a surprising number of your decisions, once you internalize that, and you start to think about levels in terms of what your companion would say about them and how she would stand when introducing them. That is something that is freeing, because it's a constraint that you can use to just race forward. And this is just one very, very basic example. I've given plenty of examples at this point. You've been listening to me for 20 minutes. You're very patient. So that is what I thought I would talk about, this idea of a visual progression as a critical storytelling aid, something that you can hang a lot of your narrative on. I think you'll find that once you started to think this way, you may stop thinking in terms of dots and circles and stuff, at least a little bit, and start to think in terms of, well, what can we do with this visual idea? How can we push this? How can we fold it? How does it fit into other progressions that we've got? And it's really fun. Anyway, let me know what you think.